Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into declassified documents and official records to tell the story of the quiet professionals who stood on the very front lines of the Cold War. It's the story of Sergeant First Class Jerry M. Genereux. To really get this story, we first have to understand the world it all happened in. For decades, the entire planet was balanced on a knife's edge. Two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were locked in a tense, high-stakes nuclear standoff. And this whole standoff was built around a terrifyingly logical idea called MAD, or mutually assured disruption. It's a pretty wild concept, right? The thinking was, if one side ever launched its weapons, the other side would launch theirs right back, and, well, that would be the end of everything for everybody. It wasn't about winning a war, it was a strategy to make sure a war never, ever started. And let me tell you, this was not just some abstract theory. In 1961, the Soviet Union shattered a voluntary ban on nuclear testing. They set off a whole series of weapons, including the single largest explosion in human history, a 58-megaton bomb. To put that in perspective, that's thousands of times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The message to the world was loud and clear. Our weapons are real and they are ready. So keeping this fragile peace meant you had to be on your toes constantly. You see, this wasn't just politics as usual. It was a flat-out technological race for survival. The only way to maintain stability was to prove, without a doubt, that your nuclear deterrent was powerful, capable, and absolutely reliable. Okay, so that leads to the big question. How did the United States prove its capabilities? I mean, how did they make sure their most powerful weapons would actually work if the unthinkable ever happened? Well, the answer was out in the vast, empty desert of Nevada at a top-secret facility called the Nevada Test Site. President Truman picked the spot back in 1950, and it quickly became the main stage for American nuclear weapons testing. It was the place where the country's most powerful tech was pushed to its limits, especially after testing kicked back into high gear in '61. And we get these incredible glimpses into what went on there, from declassified documents like the cover of this safety report for a 1987 test called Mighty Oak. These weren't just random explosions. Oh no, these were meticulously planned scientific experiments, all conducted under absolutely immense pressure. And here's something that might surprise you. This wasn't the Wild West. It was the exact opposite. Every single test had to follow strict international treaties and incredibly rigid safety protocols for radiation and containment. And look at that last point. Cost or schedule could not get in the way of a safety review. The stakes were just way too high for shortcuts. The people who did this work, they had their own precise, almost clinical language. Take a term like ground zero. For us, it means total devastation. But for them, it was an official, technical term. Just the exact spot where the device was placed for an underground test. It was a way to manage the unimaginable. But here's the crucial thing to remember. None of this was automated. It all relied on people. For that destruction to be mutually assured, the technology had to be perfect. And that perfection? It depended entirely on skilled, trusted, and incredibly disciplined human beings. So you've got to ask, right? Who were these people? Who did you hand a security clearance to? Let them behind the gates of the most sensitive military sites in the world and trust to manage the absolute front line of the Cold War? Well, the answer might not be what you think. It wasn't just generals and PhD physicists. A huge part of this mission depended on thousands of enlisted soldiers. These men and women went through insane background checks to get their security clearances. But more than that, they were trusted with incredibly precise tasks where there was literally zero room for error. The credibility of the entire nuclear deterrent rested on them doing their job flawlessly every single time. And this brings us to one of those soldiers. We can talk about the big picture all day, but this story really comes to life when you focus on one person who was actually there, who lived it. And that person is Sergeant First Class Jerry M. Genereux. He was one of those quiet professionals. This document you're looking at, this Presidential Memorial Certificate, it honors his devoted and selfless service to the nation. And right here, this is the proof. These are not your average service awards. These certificates place Sergeant Genereux right there at the Nevada Test Site as a direct participant in underground nuclear tests. Tests with names like Diamond Beach in '85 and Midas Smith in '84. And there's more. This one here confirms he was part of another test called Misty Rain. These documents, they are the tangible proof that he stood on the nuclear frontline during one of the most dangerous decades of the Cold War. And that quote, it just says it all, doesn't it? He, and thousands of others just like him, were the backbone of deterrence. Their job was never about getting famous or being in the newspapers. In fact, their job was to make sure those horrible headlines never had to be written in the first place. They just stood watch. You know, the work done by people like Sergeant Jerry M. Genereux was absolutely essential to keeping a very fragile peace for decades. And it leaves you with a final thought. In the atomic age, maybe the greatest service isn't always on the battlefield. Maybe it's in the quiet, disciplined watch that makes sure the battle never has to begin.